welcome to another episode of Let's Argue About Plants, the podcast for people who love plants.
But not always the same ones. I'm Carol Collins. I'm Associate Editor at Fine Gardening Magazine.
And I'm Danielle Sherry. I'm the Executive Editor at Fine Gardening. And I'm going to keep this intro short because I don't have much of a voice left. I don't know if I'm battling a summer cold or what, but I'm very excited to be back in the chair with you, Carol. It's been a while since I've been back in the virtual studio, and we're going to talk about tough as nails plants today.
That's right. I found a wonderful definition of tough as nail plants. This is from issue 190, I think. 195, and it's from Julie Lane Gay, and she says that a truly tough plant will thrive on its own as long as it's planted in a place that provides for its basic needs and if it's given suitable water. And she says these plants won't retreat if they have aggressive neighbors. They won't complain if they don't get pruned back for a year or two. They don't need any special treatment to look good, and they're pretty and tough and look more delicate than they really are. So does that sort of fit the bill for you? Does that?
Nice. Yeah. I don't know about the delicate part at the very end because honestly, like I looked at some of my plants, I'm like, oh my God, if there was an apocalypse tomorrow, I'm sure these things would make it. So mine aren't as delicate, but other than that, yes, that all rings very true because this isn't, these aren't plants that don't need no care, like they're still going to need care. They're still going to have, to be established, but they're going to hang tough when the going gets tough, basically. Yeah. Well, I poked online. I saw your plants because I've been out for a couple of days, so I'm a little behind the 8 ball in my choices. I was very excited about several of these because you have not talked about them on the podcast before. So which one are you going to discuss first?
Okay. Well, it's hard now to come up with plants that we haven't talked about. We've been doing this for a while.
Yeah, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, we have.
And 4 plants every couple weeks, you're going to get through some plants. So this one, I don't believe I've talked about before, and I don't know if it's been discussed on the podcast. I know it's been in the magazine, but it is Sastro bellflower, and that's Campanulus Sastro. It's hardy from zones 4 to 8, so it's super cold hardy. And this is a nice medium-sized perennial. It gets 18 to 24 inches tall, maybe 12 to 15 inches wide. It likes full sun, maybe a little bit of light shade, not crazy about deep shade. And it likes well-drained soil, but otherwise it's not too fussy about the soil that it grows in. You'll find that it blooms better and has stronger stems in the full sun. So, if anybody has partial shade and they want to try it, that's fine. You just might not get as many flowers. It's a hybrid, so it doesn't really have a native range, but I think Campanulus in general are maybe native to Europe, not North America. And Campanulus have kind of a bad reputation for being seedy and weedy. This is not one of those type of bellflowers, though. This is a polite, well-mannered bellflower. It stays where you put it, doesn't seed around. I've been growing Sastro for 5 or 6 years. And when I put it in with another bellflower that was also a leftover from our long lamented and far in the past plant sale. And so I put in the 2 cultivars. The first cultivar, which I can't even remember the name of it had white or yellow flowers. It was immediately nibbled into submission by my local rabbits.
Nibbled into submission. That was a good phrase.
It comes back. The leaves come back, but I haven't seen flowers in a couple of years. But Sastro is bunny proof, more or less. They don't seem to bother it as much, or what they eat isn't damaging it enough to prevent it from flowering. It has the most beautiful flower color. I love the indigo or purpley blue color of these flowers, and they're big. Like each flower is about 2.5 inches tall and wide. They bloom in early summer. So now we're now in midsummer, and the first flush of blooms has gone by. Irvin Etienne, who has recommended this plant before, though, says that he can get 3 bloom cycles out of it by deadheading. So once that first flush of blooms is done in early summer, cut it right back to the ground. You should get another flush of blooms, maybe 2 more flushes of blooms if you're really good about deadheading. But the caveat is that each flush will get a little bit smaller. So by the last flush of blooms, they're going to be maybe a foot shorter than that first flush. They're like 6 inches shorter each time they come back. But, who cares? Well,
right,
it's
you're getting 3 bloom flushes. Yeah.
Exactly. You got this color and interest, and, the foliage isn't bad either. It's a nice medium green. It stays nice and clean. There are insects that nibble on it. Who cares, right?
Yeah.
It has strong spiky stems to hold those big blooms up. I recently posted, and if y'all aren't following our Instagram, you should be. Like, why aren't you following us on Instagram? But I posted a picture of a Sastro bellflower with a hole chewed in the side. And that is a fascinating thing. There are many bees and wasps and possibly some other insects that do this, but this was done by a nectar robber. So
appropriate name.
Right? So these short-tongued bees, they cannot be bothered with flying up from underneath these bellflowers and crawling inside. They just cut to the chase and chew a hole in the side and get right to the sweet nectar. And the science is out whether this helps with pollination or hurts with pollination. But honestly, if you're deadheading a plant, why do you care about pollination in any way? As long as the pollinator is getting fed, that's the main function of, the nectar and pollen of the plant that you're going to deadhead. So I am not at all bothered with the nectar robbers. And in fact, I think that's kind of judgy. I think they're efficiency experts, these insects that
absolutely.
Do right?
I kind of feel like the nectar robber is like my spirit animal. Like, that's a big, long blossom. Like, that would take a lot of oomph, and then you'd have to like army crawl your way up that long blossom. No, let's just bust a hole in the side and get into that. Yeah. I mean, well done, nectar robber. I feel like you get a gold star for that.
Right. And the scientists that watch these insects all day, they say, these are insects that can do it. They just don't want to.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, well done. I will say again, maybe might be my spirit animal insect right there. Right. Yes, you have the capabilities, but you just don't want to.
Right.
That's so great. That's very cool. And I like the fact that it's a well-behaved campanula because, bellflowers do, there's quite a few species that shall remain nameless that I have yanked out just because they're so thuggish and they really do take over. It ends up looking more weedy and aggressive than, than tough as nails. So that's very cool. Well, so I'm going to go into Shrubville because, it's me and I'm going into Shrubville. And ironically, I have over the years gotten incredibly allergic to poison ivy. And this plant looks like poison ivy, but I love it. And this is Gro-low fragrant sumac. So it's a Rhus aromatica Gro-low. It's zones 4 to 9. And this was a plant that I had my eyes on for a few years. It's a newer cultivar, newer meaning within the last decade, but it's a newer cultivar, a very, very tough plant. And I wanted it for a very specific purpose on my property. Back where Hospital Hill is, which is on the back of my property, is a bunch of really, really, as I've said before in other podcast episodes, horrible soil that was lean foundation fill that, when my house was built eons ago, just was dumped in a big pile. It's in full sun. It's really extremely well-drained soil, and it doesn't get a lot of attention around this place. But we have a patio, a bluestone patio that comes right up to it, and then a rock wall that kind of keeps Hospital Hill at bay. There is a 1 foot wide little area of soil between those two areas. And it's crappy soil because it's from Hospital Hill. And I wanted something to fill that up and kind of soften that edge between the bluestone patio and the stone wall in full sun with really bad soil. So I popped in some bare root, and I did plant these as bare root in fall, fragrant sumac, the Gro-low variety. And 3 years on, it is the only thing that has survived in that extremely tough environment. I have tried lavender. I have tried catmint. I have tried so many other things that have it is too punishing an area for it. And Gro-low is the only thing that has looked really, really good. And by really good, I mean it looks like poison ivy a bit. It's got a 3-part leaf to it. So leaves of 3, beware of me, does not apply for this particular sumac. It is not one of the poison sumac family as well. We should talk about this. Me, as somebody who's very allergic to that whole family of plants, does not get any sort of reaction to this at all. So this is a very benign member of that family. It is about 2 to 3 feet tall. In a very punishing environment such as where I have it planted, it's only about 1.5 feet tall after 3 years. And this will spread to about 6 feet wide if you let it, if you have that kind of space for it. I do not, so it kind of stays in bounds. It stays about as big as you'll let it. Fast growing ground cover, great for erosion control if that's something that you're looking for. Full sun, obviously really, really lean soil. The leaves get a bit glossy, which is really, really pretty. As the new growth comes out, it's a little bronzy, which is also very, very nice. It does have a fragrance to it, kind of a spicy fragrance to it. And the best part about this plant, I think, is fall. And it really, I keep comparing it to poison ivy. Nobody's going to want to grow this plant, but much like poison ivy, it gets this gorgeous red, almost lit the plant on fire look to it in fall. And that foliage turns very, very dark burgundy red. We'll have an inset photo of that in the show notes and on the video version of this podcast. You guys can actually watch us if you want to, instead of just listen to us on the podcast. If you go to YouTube or finegardening.com and click on that podcast tab. But I've seen this plant grow in the most punishing of circumstances. I thought I had a punishing circumstance, but I was out in the Midwest last week for a work event, and I saw this growing in the parking lot of a box store in the Midwest. So I know that little traffic circle gets hit by snowplows left and right. It obviously gets a ton of radiant heat because it was surrounded by asphalt on all sides. And Gro-low looked beautiful. This sumac is just a real showstopper. I also wanted to say too that I have a now watership down level of rabbits in my yard. Hooray! Have not seen it get nibbled on by that. And then we also have herds of deer, as we've talked about before, and the deer seem to leave it alone as well. So yeah, I would say that this plant and Twinkies is what will be left over after the apocalypse for sure. All right, so I went with a shrub, you went with a perennial. We are very predictable ladies. Carol, what do you have next up on your list?
I figured I should go to Shrubville too, at least once during the episode. So my next one is a shrub, and it's black lace elderberry. That's Sambucus nigra, and the cultivar name is Eva. So black lace is a trade name, and it is hardy from zones 4 to 7. So it's notably cold hardy, but it does not love the summer heat. It will have much better color and will grow much better in the cooler summer climates like ours. So it's medium size, grows 6 to 8 feet tall and wide. It likes full sun to partial shade, average to wet soil, tolerates dry soil, not fussy about pH. So acidic, basic soil, it's fine. It has these beautiful, finely cut leaves that are deep, almost purplish black color. Super hard to photograph, I might add. It's just, it's just a hard color to photograph, but it looks fantastic in the garden. It's really good contrast for all the greens. It makes pastels look classy. It tones down hot colors. Just a great companion plant with that fine texture and that great color. And it's a real workhorse. Like I said, super tough. If you can cut it back to the ground, it will flush a ton of new growth, kind of like a perennial amount of growth in a single season. So if you really can't be bothered with letting something get 6 to 8 feet tall and wide, you cut it back every year, it'll probably get maybe 3 or 4 feet each year. I've left mine alone. It's probably 5 feet wide, less than 4 feet tall. And I think that might be because it gets some shade. But it can be grown in containers, very flexible, super fun. If you want it to make berries, you need to grow it with another compatible elderberry. So some of its pollinizers are Black Beauty, Instant Karma, and Laced Up. It flowers in late spring, early summer. It's done flowering now in midsummer, but the flowers are really cool, white with a sort of pinkish tint to them, and the pollinators just love it. If you find it encroaching on a pathway, just whack one of those branches back to the base. It doesn't care. It's super tough. I don't know. I think that for whether you're growing mostly perennials, whether you're a shrub grower, whatever it is, like this is a get along and go along kind of plant. Just like, you can mix it in, quite carefree, difficult to move, but easy to grow from cuttings. If you want another one nearby, you can do softwood cuttings in the summer. And super fun plant. I like this one.
I have tried and killed this plant. So my question is it in my establishment techniques, as in it needs to be well watered to get established? Because I had read like, oh, it's so easy, just whack off a branch and stick it in the ground. And does it perhaps need like a little bit more care in the upfronts?
This is a plant that really likes wet soil. In fact, if wet soil was your problem, this would be a good solution plant for that. For those of us that, are gardening in basically gravel, you probably, when you're first trying to get it established, I think extra water in that first season would be helpful, especially if we're having one of those long dry spells, which we seem to be getting more and more. So if you're having trouble, it might be a lack of water, because it will tolerate dry soil. It doesn't love it. And that's when it will kind of start to look bad too. And like I said, super hot weather, especially if you're in the southeast or the deep south, you're going to see more green than purple. So it's like it'll still struggle through. It just won't look as great in certain circumstances.
So that makes sense, because it could have been like during one of those freak summers, which are now frequent instead of freak summers, that it's like, I tried to give it a whirl in June, and what do you mean I got to water it to keep it alive? All right, well done. Well, and sometimes that's worth it, because, Sun King Aurelia is like that, right? To get that plant established, you really do have to be like diligent about the water. Now, we've just gone through a stretch of dry, hot weather, and it's looking great outside, but it needed that establishment period. So, all right, maybe I will have to give that a whirl again. It's one that has been on the list of the killers. I've killed many of those. Drops of Jupiter golden oregano. So that's oreganum. Drops of Jupiter 4 to 9 is our zonal range. I can't believe I actually planted this, because oregano is like known to be a beast. I mean, I think people know this. You start your first herb garden when you just get started in gardening. You're like, yay, I'm going to do parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, and oregano. And the next thing you know, all you have is an herb garden of oregano, right? Because it's so beastly. It is aggressive. It takes over. But, I was captured by this chartreuse slash golden leaved oregano. Its leaves were very petite, very small, and teardrop like, if you will, as in its common name. And I had heard that it was a sterile hybrid. So I thought, okay, let me give it a whirl. This sounds like if any oregano wasn't going to be a beast, it would be this one. So I planted this fairly new herb plant. It was a sample plant that we had gotten samples of maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I planted it in the Voles Superhighway because there's very few plants. Alliums will survive in the Voles Superhighway. My Nepeta will survive in the Voles Superhighway, but many plants have been pulled down into the depths and never to be seen from again. And I thought, all right, let's give this one a whirl, because oregano, it still has that oregano quality of being quite pungent, and kind of oily when you crush the leaves. So it still maintains some of that culinary oregano properties. And it has thrived and done exceptionally well. It has stayed well behaved. It's about 1.5 feet tall. It says it can get up to 2 feet and about 3 feet wide. Mine's a little bit smaller, maybe about 2 feet wide. Makes this very lovely billowy ground cover. I've already mentioned what its companion plants are, which is the allium and the nepeta. I've got some sedums, some creeping low-growing sedums in that stretch too, and it really looks exceptional with all of those, especially that chartreuse foliage. I have it in a full sun scenario, so it's almost tending on the yellow foliage side, but given a little bit more shade, it's going to be more in that chartreuse area. This is really a plant though that wants 6 to 8 hours of full sun a day. Well-drained soil, lean soil does well in both of those scenarios, which is really great. This was a plant that when it came in, and I can't really recall if it came in looking like holy hell or if it sat in my driveway in a pot for a few weeks and then looked really, really terrible. But I can remember what I ended up doing was just chopping it completely down, completely back. I scalped it. It was, mid-spring or so. So it really just looked like sticks in a pot. Threw it in the ground, made sure that I did, a little bit of supplemental watering that first year. And since then, it has just taken off gangbusters. Gets covered in kind of these almost raceme looking pink purple flowers that are really, really tiny. Pollinators love it. You'll start to see those pollinators buzzing around and it looks like the plant's alive with activity. So it's a polite spreader, but definitely not an aggressive spreader. If you've grown culinary oreganos before, this is not the same animal. The thing that I have noticed the last couple of years, and I feel like now it's we always talk about our favorite plants on this podcast, right? But these are not infallible plants. Plants get diseases, they get pests, and this plant is susceptible to the 4-line bug. It does get that damage where it almost looks like little brown scattershot holes basically onto mostly the newer growth that it pushes out. It's really just cosmetic, and I know it's concerning to people, and then you think, oh God, this is a problem plant. It's not. Once that 4-line beetle has gone through its, mature stage, and then it's gone off to other, greener pastures, the plant will push new foliage. If you really don't like it and it's unsightly, you can go in there and prune some of that out. It'll push new growth and be good. But I did want to bring that up because that is something that I think concerns people sometimes. But for better or worse, it's a great little plant, and it's drops of Jupiter golden oregano. For anybody who grew up in the 2000s and knows the band Train, they had a song, Drops of Jupiter. I was not a fan of that band, but I am a fan of that plant. Okie dokie, Carol, we are at the halfway point of this engaging topic of tough as nails plants. What is your next nail plant?
Okay, so my next one is an annual for most of us. It is a perennial in zones 8 to 10, and it's California poppy. And you don't just have to be in California to grow California poppy. Its botanical name has an awful lot of consonants all in one row. It's Eschlosia californica.
Yes.
Oh my heavens! Like I wouldn't want to have to spell that in the spelling bee.
No.
As I said,
Starts with an E. Do we get points for that?
Oh my goodness! ESHSH. Oh my goodness! It's crazy. Eschlosia.
Eschlosia.
Gets 12 to 18 inches tall and wide. Loves full sun. Average to dry soil. Absolutely loves well-drained soil. This is a very water-wise plant. It can tolerate the variable rainfall like they get in California. It can subsist on the drip from coastal fog in months when there's no rain at all. It's native to the western U.S., down into northern Mexico. And like I said, it's an annual for most of us, but it can be a short-lived, deep-rooted perennial. And I have actually had plants over winter for me, and we had a remarkably mild winter last winter. I would say we had like a zone 7 or a zone 8 type winter last winter with no real hard freezes. And so I had a couple plants that the tops died down and it came back from the base. But most of my plants are seeds from the last year, which was the first year that I grew this. And this is not one that you start indoors ahead of time. It really wants to be seeded directly in the spot where it's going to grow. Sprinkled right on top of the soil. Do not bury it because the seeds are very tiny, just the way nature would do it. What I think is funny about this plant is that it disperses its seeds quite violently, like with an explosion, and you can get a plant 6 feet away from where the parent plant was just because its mother flung that seed as far as she could get it.
I feel like many mothers might relate to that when it comes to certain children.
Right? Time to leave the nest. Pretty, feathery, glaucous, green-blue foliage. The flowers are yellow to bright orange, very cheerful. They open in the sun. They close if it gets cloudy. They like to close before it rains. I have seen them, though, when the rain comes too fast, they get caught out and they get rained on, and they're fine, but I think they would prefer to be closed. The flowers start, it depends where you are when the flowers are going to start. If you're in California, you may see flowers when the rains come in the spring. For us, it's late spring to early summer, and they will continue to rebloom until September if the conditions are favorable. So I actually tried, and this was an impulse buy. I was at the garden center in late spring, and I saw Mission Bells was the mix, and it has white and pink and some double flowers. And I sure did get a couple of those pretty interesting colors the first year, but everything that came back this year is yellow or bright orange. So I was encouraged to do this by the article that Jared Barnes did for us about plant survival strategies. And it occurred to me that I have a lot of survivor plants in my garden, and I have a lot of stress tolerators, but I didn't have a lot of rooterals. I didn't have a lot of plants that subsist by self-seeding. And so I decided to try one, and this is one I tried, and I could not possibly love it more. It's a fun filler plant and so easy to add to a garden if you have any open space in full sun.
So Carol, do you pretty much at this point do you ensure that you've got seed, and do you go out and do any collecting, or do you just, like, at this point, a couple years in, just let it do its thing, and without fail it pretty much self-sows to the next season?
So to be on the safe side, because I wasn't sure how it was going to go, I bought more seed and I sowed it in early spring in a different section. But I found that last year's planting came back just fine with the seed that it had and the plants that survived the winter. I really didn't need to reseed in the area that was planted last year. So as long as the conditions are favorable, I guess, is the one caveat. If it's too shady, if it's too wet, it's not going to. But too cold in the winter, that is really not an issue, because it's coming back from seeds rather than perennials trying to survive our winters.
That's awesome. Okay, so that's okay. That's good to know, because I wasn't sure. You're a adept seed starter, so I thought, oh, are you just like insuring and making sure and going out there and collecting seed? But you're pretty confident that, given if it wasn't, a horrifically wet, spring or optimum condition, that a self-sowing over the winter where it's not incredibly hardy, it would come back. You'd get babies the next year.
Yeah, I think so. And that's also as long as it did set seed. If you don't have flowers, you're not going to get seeds, but you'll know. And if someone is interested in collecting seed, you can look up online, because there are lots of people who give you advice on when it's time to collect, because like I said, when it's really, really ready, it's going to explode and seeds are going to go everywhere. You want to catch it right before that. So you're looking for the color of the seed capsule, and you want to make sure it's right before you harvest.
Absolutely. And I just want to, one of our regional reporters for the Pacific Northwest, Fanula Campion, actually wrote about a cultivar of California poppy that is her absolute favorite plant, and it is a white flower, which normally I'm not into white, but because of this yellow center that it has to it, it was one of truly the most beautiful plants I've ever seen. So go to the My Region tab on finegardening.com, look up one of Fanula's posts from about a year ago, and you'll see that California poppy that's white. It's so beautiful. Because you know how I feel about orange, so.
I know.
All right. So I was looking around the garden and going, all right, well, most of my truly tough as nails plants survive in these areas of full sun, lean soil, terrible conditions in that regard. But, you need tough plants in the shade too. So I'm going to go back to an oldie but a goodie and recommend European wild ginger, Asarum europeum, which is zones 5 to 8. I know that I'm going to get letters, and go ahead, send me the letters. I like all letters, even if they're not nice letters, because folks will say, well, why aren't you picking any of the native gingers? There's a ton of native gingers out there. And let me tell you, yes, and they're lovely. The Canadian ginger, which is an East Coast ginger, absolutely beautiful plant. However, I'm looking for something in a specific area that is going to stay a bit shorter, so I only want, 6 to 8 inches tall. And there is something about European ginger, because it's got that very shiny leaf to it, that is just beautiful. I mean, it's the little black dress of shade gardening. It makes everything and everybody look good. And I truly love it as being a tough ground cover for, those understory plantings. It's a really polite mingler, at the cocktail party. It saddles up to its neighbors, has a nice little conversation, makes them look better. The painted ferns, the hacknacloa, any of those makes those plants truly shine and look great. So because of the smaller stature, because of the glossy foliage, I'm going with the European native. But I do feel like most gingers, most of the Asarum family, be them natives or non-native, are very truly tough shade plants. So as I said, around 6 to 8 inches tall, around 12 feet wide, it masses out politely. And it also has these side stems, which is how it roots out. So you'll often see that it's almost layering itself, which makes it very convenient for slicing off those little layerings and transplanting to other areas, which you'll want to do because this tends to be a pricey plant at the nursery. So buy a couple and then wait a few years and you'll get dividables that you'll be able to transplant into other areas and not drop your entire paycheck on European ginger. This is very drought tolerant once established. I have it in areas of extremely dry shade at the base of mature hemlock trees, which are thirsty plants. And once I got these European gingers established in their spot, they did very well. I do not supplemental water them at all. During extremely dry spring summers, I will notice that it will be an appreciable smaller plant. It does not mass out to its full potential, but we've just come off of a fairly wet spring, so they're looking pretty phenomenal this year. No pests or diseases really that I can think of that have ever affected my plants, and with a little bit of research, I was not seeing anybody complaining about anything in particular. Sometimes you will get some fungal diseases if you're in an area of really high humidity, and that's only because this plant makes almost these little lily pad like leaves, and they are packed into this tight little bushy rosette almost. So, not a whole lot of airflow. So if you're in an area, probably on the edge of zone 8 with a lot of humidity, I'm thinking, down in South Carolina, you might see a little bit of fungal disease. But here's the great thing, because the other big kind of bold leaf plant that's in the shade everybody thinks of is hostas, and those get marred by deer and slugs and snails. And European ginger, although a smaller version of that, has a very bold leaf, and I've never seen any damage of that from deer or slugs or snails, which is awesome. I think it's probably because of that waxiness of the outside leaf. It almost looks plastic sometimes. That maybe that's it. The slugs are like, man, I'm out of here. I've been fooled by a plastic plant before, and they keep it moving. But yeah, this is just a really extremely tough, great shade to partial shade plant. You got sun, you're out of the game with this one. It's just really beautiful, and the darkest, deepest green possible. I'm going to attempt to go out a little bit later and get a like as the sun is setting photo, because that's when I kind of get a little filtered sunlight onto my patch, and you can really see that glossiness during that time. But yeah, European wild ginger, or any of the ginger family.
So my next one is a follow-up on a plant that I discovered last year when we were visiting the farmer's daughter as our field trip. And that is agave leaf sea holly, which is Eryngium agavifolium, and that is zone 6 to 9. It grows 2 to 4 feet tall and wide. It likes full sun, partial shade, well-drained soil. Sandy soil is great, which is lucky for me because that's what I have. And it's native to Argentina. But somehow we can grow it here in North America. So I'll take it. So I bought this not knowing anything about it. And on that podcast about a year ago, I talked about it with only the information that I had on the plant tag. But what a great plant it has turned out to be. It starts out with a basal rosette of glossy sword-like leaves. They have a jagged edge. They really do look like weapons. Great color. And we both agreed when we saw it at the nursery that it looks a little bit like an agave, but it's not as sharp. Like those little picky pointies it has on its leaves, they won't really hurt you. I have this growing in an area I call Rattlesnake Master Hill. It's got Eryngium yuccifolium, which we know as Rattlesnake Master. And it also has other Eryngiums, other sea hollies nearby. So it's kind of all my prickly things are all in one place. And the deer leave all of these alone. But when you see the photo in the show notes, if you go to finegardening.com, click on the podcast tab and you can see the photos that we have of each of these plants. So in my photo that I put in, you can see it side by side. It's in the foreground and Rattlesnake Master in the background, so you can compare the foliage. Rattlesnake Master tends to have a more glaucous, whitish blue, greenish blue foliage, and this is more of a yellowish green and more glossy. So I like the contrast between the two. And the flowers are similar too. So the basal foliage like maybe gets 2 feet tall, maybe 2.5 feet tall, but then it shoots up this stalk with little sort of thimble-shaped prickly flowers, and they're whitish green. Again, similar to the Rattlesnake Master flowers. And as they age, they turn chocolate brown, which that's a polite description. I am not crazy about the look of the browned out flowers. But if you want seeds, then you got to let it do its thing. And this is not, from what I've been reading, this is not an especially long-lived perennial. Like the individual plants aren't going to be super durable. So what you want are the offsets that start to form around the base of the plant, similar again to agaves, or seedlings. And the seedlings establish themselves quite readily. And when they're young, you can move them, but you really want to move them when they're small because they develop a long taproot that's a little bit fragile. So once they get too big, you really should leave it where it is and hope for seedlings in the future. But my plant has started making its first offset, and the first year it sleeps. The second year, mine leapt. It's doing super well. So I'll be curious to follow along with this plant and learn from it and see how it grows and see if it will actually self-seed. But so far I've been very happy with this experiment.
I mean, say no more. It's got agave in the name. I mean, you know how I feel about my agaves and my agave collection. So that's amazing. I'm excited. Yeah, that was a very cool plant when you picked that up at Farmer's Daughter. And I'm glad to hear the report back that it's doing well. And it's actually a tough as nails plant to boot. So that's awesome. So I feel like I'm going to end with maybe another oldie but goodie, because there's a reason that, oldies and goodies stay around, and that's generally because they are easy plants and they persist without us having to have much intervention, so that makes them tough as nails. And I feel like there's several hardy geraniums that would fit the bill. I failed miserably with Roseanne geranium. Roseanne and I did not get along. It's everybody's favorite geranium, I feel like. It's in every garden you go to, and it's so beautiful, and it, sometimes trails up through like larger shrubs and makes pillowy, beautiful like masses. It did not do that for me, and I have a feeling because I have the world's poorest soil. Despite amending and mulching and doing all of that, I'm on fill. It's gravelly, it's sandy, it's very lean, and I think Roseanne needs a little bit more of, that organic material at her feet to do well. But I tend to do very, very well with the geranium cantabrigiense family of geraniums. And there's two that I love, but today I'm going to talk about Carmina because she's a gem. She's an absolute gem. There's no other way to put it. Forms beautiful little basal rosettes of tiny palmate leaves that just look really, really adorable when they first come out in spring. The new growth has a bit of a blush to it, so you get a little bit of green on pink foliage. Only 6 to 8 inches tall, so this is a petite, polite geranium, hardy geranium, unlike Roseanne, who I will say is a little bit of a beast sometimes, and she likes to take up a lot more real estate than I have for her. And Carmina, 1 to 1.5 feet wide, really just these pillowy, gorgeous little, cute little tufts. It is an everywhere plant. Do you have full sun? Then yes, you can plant Carmina hardy geranium. Do you have full shade? Then yes, you can plant Carmina hardy geranium. And if you have anything in between, yes, you can plant Carmina hardy geranium. You're going to get the most flowering in full sun. You're going to get a decent amount of flowers in partial shade, and then in full shade, you're going to get, a fair smattering, but definitely not as much flower power in the shade. But again, that's a great plant. These everywhere plants, if you're somebody who suffers from onesieitis, where you've got one of every single plant that ever struck your fancy, this is a great plant to intermingle throughout all of your beds and borders, and it really kind of makes it look like you've got a cohesive plan going on, when really you do not. Deer and rabbit resistant, geraniums, if the only geranium in your life is the ones that go into window boxes and containers and they've got that pungent smell, yes, that is what hardy geraniums smell like as well, and honestly probably taste like, which means that they escape bunnies and deer grazing on them. This is a sterile hybrid, so it masses out and becomes ground cover like due to side stems that, almost like the European ginger I was talking about, do something similar. They layer out into these almost stolon like side stems, and then over time you'll get a beautiful carpet of this Carmina geranium. They're easily transplanted if you want to take this plant and dot it all through the landscape, or if you just want it to stay into a tight, tiny mound, you can chop it off and be done with it into this little, small pillowy tuft. So we talked about the flowers, but we didn't really go into them. They are 5-petal magenta pink. They say carmine red. And listen, I'm not an artistic person. Carol can probably weigh in on this, but when I hear carmine red, I think red, but it's not red. It's a magenta-y pink, which is really, really beautiful against that dark green foliage. They will put their biggest show on in mid-spring. You will get repeat blooming sporadically through summer, and then if you do a little bit of the chop just to get it to kind of refresh the foliage and stuff in summer, which is they tend to look a little raggedy, give it a little bit of a chop, and then you'll get a rebloom again in fall. Not as many flowers, but a decent amount. It's just a really, really nice plant. It's very hardy. I also love a plant that pays for itself. So you buy one of these 1 gallons, you pop it in. The next year you're going to be able to start dividing this plant and make more and more. And it really is a truly tough as nails plant. In case I didn't mention it at the top, it's zones 5 to 8. I have been in a garden where I've seen Carmina doing well in zone 9, not going to like very, very humid weather though, and not going to do well in the summer, in the south, in a full sun location. So if you are in that area, you're going to want to put it into some partial shade. And now, because everything sounds better with a British accent, here's Peter to talk about Peterville? And wait, a story about some guy named Skeeter?
A tale of undesirable, tough as nails plants. Once upon a time in the small, charming village of Peterville, there was a gardener named Skeeter, who had an uncanny knack for inadvertently killing plants. Although he had the best intentions, Skeeter's garden was a veritable graveyard for anything green and leafy. Yet amid this botanical carnage, there were a few plants that seemed not only to survive, but to thrive, as if fueled by Skeeter's gardening failures. It all started with the dandelions. Skeeter had decided to turn a new leaf, pun intended, and plant a lovely bed of delicate roses. Armed with a watering can and sheer determination, Skeeter set to work. But no matter how carefully he tended the roses, the dandelions would pop up, defiant and proud. In a fit of frustration, Skeeter decided to outsmart them with a homemade herbicide concoction made of vinegar, salt and soap. But to his astonishment, the dandelions drank it up like a refreshing summer cocktail. Instead of withering away, they seemed to grow taller and stronger, their bright yellow flowers mocking Skeeter's efforts. Desperate, he tried pulling them out by hand, but their roots were like boat anchors, refusing to budge. The roses, on the other hand, wilted at the mere whiff of the herbicide, leaving me, Skeeter, with a patch of gloriously triumphant dandelions. Then there were the thistles. These spiky intruders had a special fondness for Skeeter's vegetable patch. No matter how often he dug them up, they'd reappear overnight like prickly ninjas. He tried everything from covering the ground with cardboard to a daily verbal bollocking, but the thistles only grew fiercer. Once, Skeeter even tried singing to them, hoping a gentle lullaby might lull them into submission. Instead, they seemed to thrive on the attention, growing even more robust and prickly. One day, Skeeter's friend at a gardening magazine suggested using a flame weeder, a device that scorches offensive plants with fire. Skeeter, seeing this as a last-ditch effort, eagerly went onto Amazon and ordered the flamethrower. You truly can find anything on there. With a maniacal gleam in his eye, Skeeter torched the thistles, imagining victory at last. However, the thistles, like miniature dragons, seemed to enjoy the heat. They rose from the ashes, stronger and more intimidating than ever, while Skeeter's spinach wilted in terror. In the end, despite these botanical battles, Skeeter's garden had its charm. The dandelions and thistles added a wild, untamed beauty that no perfectly manicured lawn could match. And Skeeter, though often exasperated, couldn't help but admire the resilience of these tough-as-nails plants. They had survived against all odds, thriving on neglect, misuse, and outright assault. And so, in Peterville, Skeeter's garden became famous, not for its pristine roses or lush vegetables, but for the indomitable spirit of its wild and wily plants. Neighbours would come by to marvel at the towering dandelions and the indestructible thistles. Skeeter, now a reluctant expert in unkillable plants, shares the tales of his gardening mishaps with a chuckle and a shake of the head, secretly proud of the resilient greenery that has turned a failed garden into a local legend.
So, Carol, that story sounded suspiciously like it might actually be Peter that the story was about.
Do you think? Yeah.
All right, let's see if we can get an honest accounting of some tough-as-nails plants from our expert, Kim Toscano, who is in Oklahoma, where plants really do need to be tough.
Hello, gardening friends. My name's Kim Toscano. I'm a horticulturalist and garden writer in sunny Oklahoma. When it comes to tough plants, I look for species that are both heat and drought tolerant, because not all heat-loving plants can withstand dry periods. This is particularly true of plants that come from tropical locations. Now, where I garden, temperatures can top 100 degrees for much of the summer, and rainfall is very unpredictable. So I tend to use a lot of regionally native plants because they're well adapted to these challenging growing conditions. One of my favorite perennials for summer blooms is hoary vervain, or Verbena stricta. This plant produces long flower spikes covered with tiny purple-blue flowers that open sequentially along the stem and last for several weeks. In my garden, they begin blooming around June and they continue for about 6 to 7 weeks. So they provide great color over a long period and also a good source of nectar for native bees and butterflies. This plant tolerates a range of soil conditions. It thrives on dry, sandy, or even rocky soil, but I actually have clay and it performs beautifully in my garden and even self-sows. You want to keep hoary vervain on the dry side and expect them to grow about 2 to 4 feet tall and 1 to 2 feet wide. I also like to use prairie grasses because they don't require a lot of pampering. In fact, they might flop over if you give them too much water or fertilizer. The switch grasses are beautiful. They offer a great variety when it comes to foliage color and plant size, and they also adapt to both wet and dry conditions. The variety Cloud 9 is quite stunning. It towers over the garden, growing 5, 6, 7 feet tall and 3, 4, 5 feet wide, but it's the flower heads that really set it apart. The plant produces these airy panicles that nearly envelop the entire plant, producing a cloud-like effect. That's where the plant gets its common name or varietal name, Cloud 9. Now, switchgrass provides good wildlife habitat. You'll find many songbirds feeding on the seeds, and it's quite tough. In addition to heat and drought tolerance, switchgrasses withstand deer browsing. They can also grow near black walnut trees, and if you're a coastal gardener, you'll be happy to know that they tolerate salt spray. Another tough native plant is rattlesnake master, Oringium yuccifolium. Now this plant looks as tough as it is. It has thick yucca-like foliage and spiky flower heads. The blue-green foliage is very upright, and the flower heads stand on stalks that are maybe 3 to 5 feet tall. They provide a very strong architectural element in the garden. And each stem holds about 10 or so flower heads that are packed with tiny white blooms, and these blooms are a valuable source of nectar to native bees and wasps, butterflies, and other insects. Rattlesnake master has a deep taproot and an extensive root system that provides that staying power through even the most severe drought. Rattlesnake master combines beautifully with the hoary vervain I mentioned, as well as other prairie perennials like butterfly weed or purple coneflower. You could give these plants a backdrop of cloud-9 switchgrass, and you have a gorgeous, low-maintenance garden that thrives in the heat of summer.
Well, it should be mentioned that Kim was not chosen by surprise as our expert, because in our forthcoming new issue, Kim actually has a feature article about plants for extreme heat, and those are definitely tough as nails plants. So if you liked what she had to say as the expert, please pick up our latest issue of Fine Gardening. It will be available in mailboxes on August 10th and as well as online. And that's Kim Toscano, and she had one on plants for extreme heat. I want them all.
Yes, and our listeners should know that they can get an all-access subscription and go back in time and see all kinds of tough plants that have been recommended over the years. So, yeah, highly recommend,
Yes,
and
absolutely.
You'll get Kim's article as well if you subscribe to that. Subscribe today.
That's great.